All right. Okay, well, we're going to get into it. I'd like to greet everybody who's on. Thank the Almighty for allowing us to come together to continue our discussion and also just having mercy upon us and allowing us to make it to another one, another day. We pray for longevity. So we will start with this here, part 2, or section 2 of the Communist Manifesto, Proletarians and Communists. And the internet copy will be beginning on page 23. Last paragraph, it starts from the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital. Did you happen to bring your copy?
Yeah, I got it. I'm trying to see what page
What
it
number? I think it's, I want to say it's 30. Paragraph 30 in that edition.
is. And what chapter is it?
Section 2 or chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. I think it's 30.
Chapter 2?
Yeah.
Wait, section 2, like,
Section 2.
oh, this is section 3.
Yeah,
I
that's-
think it was booked. I
Yeah,
had marked on
just
section 2.
past it just a little bit.
Okay.
Let's see. 30. Yep. 30. Yeah, so in the Phil Gasper edition, we'll be starting at paragraph 30. And we're going to move forward with this. Just a reminder, why in the world I've been convinced to go through things like this. I heard it, the truth is, well, some can argue that people are not born revolutionaries. They turn into revolutionaries once they learn about revolution. And the argument that I believe is that the Bible is a book on revolution. And the scriptures that I read and the scriptures that had seemed to be obscure in times past, it appears that they starting to make more sense. When the God of heaven said that the people or mankind have turned his glory into shame, how can that happen? How can that happen? I'm using that word scientifically or to signify it concretely, using knowledge to signify it or to describe it concretely. Not with idealist views, but concretely, how can mankind turn God's glory into shame? Could it be that the deeds of man are to reflect or to bring into realization the glory of God and not the idea of a figure coming out of space or out of the clouds? And it seems to be the same thing where people can confess that they have made hell. They say, well, we're living in hell. Well, there was no being that came from the center of the earth and did it. No one's seen that happen. No one's seen someone come from the pits of Hades, which people figure is in the center of the earth, and some being run around and did all of this. What we see is hell. It's being realized through people, and it's very important if we're going to believe the Bible. I argue, you could take it or leave it, is that we must develop revolutionary theory. Okay, and unless someone have another idea, I'm willing to hear it. Meaning, people can talk about how bad things are, and some people don't want to talk about it. In fact, when you talk about the conditions of the world today, when you talk about what we're facing, sometimes people get overloaded and they don't even want to deal with it. They want to look on the bright side. So in essence, they turn away from revolution. And what I'm saying is, you look around you, our food supply is under attack. Our living situation is under attack. They're trying to drive the masses, if they haven't done it already, into debt, because the ruling class saying is, a person in debt do not go on strike. They do not resist, in other words. And the reason why they prevail out of the ruling class own ideas and their own confessions, I should say. The reason why they prevail is because of ignorance. Ho Chi Minh argued the same thing. The mainstay of capitalism or any forms of oppression is ignorance. You have this other theory, it's called Hume's paradox, from David Hume. The paradox was, how is it that the masses who have the power find themselves in subjection to those few? Or how is it that the controlled, or those who are under control of the people, or under control of the small minority, how is it that that takes place when those who are under control actually possesses the power to keep everything running? So this Hume paradox is, it boils back down to ignorance. Ignorance, ignorance. It's a battle of ideas. And this is what I learned out the Bible. The Messiah went on a mission to educate. That's where it starts. You just can't sweep it under the rug. You can't pretend like it don't exist, because you leave it to the capitalists. They want to have, they plan to have more people homeless. They plan to have more people assaulted through this stuff that they call food. They plan to have more people working with wages at bare minimum. Stuff we've been reading. And who changes this? Each generation say that another person is going to do it, right? No, that's not true, because the proof is in the pudding. The generations which preceded us stood up and fought. With the knowledges that they had, they stood up and fought for the things as far as minimum wage. There was no minimum wage. There was laws also. I mean, minimum wage was unspoken, meaning the capitalists could determine whatever the person minimum wage was. In other words, what they figured that it takes for this person to live and not die out. They came up with that, but there was no law of you must pay this or you must pay that. You know, we got to look at, you know, there was a law that a person couldn't ask for more wages. It was against the law for the laborer to ask for more. I mean, the people today are just totally, they just don't know about this. They just don't know. And some don't even care to know because of this mass ignorance. This mass ignorance. Yes, David Hume. Yes. So we got to learn, okay, when we're looking at when we're looking at this manifesto, I'm arguing that the manifesto, this is the Gentiles or the nations' way of crying out for justice. And I'm reading this to see how even a person that who have the spirit of the law, of the Torah, of Moses, without having the written code, how it was in them. How does homelessness, poisoning the food, etc., benefit the capitalists? Homelessness benefits the capitalists because it causes the those who have homes, it causes them to work for less. It causes human beings to compete, because if that person who have a home don't want to be homeless, then he will sacrifice a great deal to maintain or keep his status, no matter how small it is, inside of the capitalist society. Poisoning the food, that benefits the capitalists because they have turned sickness into a commodity. So just as the capitalists they produce a lot of televisions for buying and selling, for John D. Rockefeller and his oil-based pharmaceuticals, it have created a cesspool of ill people that have become commodities, or should I say, yes, commodities, which are sold on the market. And you notice this is what Obama was saying when he required everyone to get health care. This was a benefit for the capitalists to force human beings to get health care. And when they got health care, if you go back and do your research, this is when the escalation of pharmaceuticals began to go through the roof. They began to raise the price because they were locked in. The people were locked in by penalty to shop the marketplace. That's what Obama called it, the marketplace. You had to shop for insurers. So this benefits them. It benefits them greatly. And it also benefits them where they can sort of, again, they can get what they need out of the people. In other words, they give you they pump you up with some medicines and stuff like that, just to keep you pumped up.
There is no moving on from this. You either move forward or you stand still, but there is no moving on.
Need you to
really got a degree in fundraising.
I don't know.
Why did you do that? To be able to raise enough money to be able to help families. How many families?
Okay. All right. Now, as I was saying, that they pump us up with pharmaceuticals just to get more labor out of us. And at the end of the day, once we on our last leg, they don't give a dog on whether we perish or not, because they got to make room for the next generation of workers. Revolution. And if we don't understand this and we continue to wait, because I think one of the things is, this is what I have been taught. It is, Shalom, Mother Thompson. It is pretty much, we've been indoctrinated with Christ is going to do it all. I mean, that indoctrination goes so far that there is no accountability to the planet. We don't feel we need to do anything, and yet we are pining away through devastation. We are being totally assaulted by the powers. You know, it's just amazing. It's the only thing I can relate it to, if you go back to the days of the abolitionists, when you have the indentured servants, you had the slaves, they just didn't pray for freedom. They just didn't pray, you know, and just work the field. They made efforts to make changes. And we're talking about now something even more noble. We're talking about the liberation of mankind. Now, we're going to begin in this Communist Manifesto, and I just wanted to explain to people this is important. If you're not convinced of revolution, you won't do revolution. if you're not concerned about what's happening around you and all of these casualties, you're not going to, anyone who's bringing this up becomes a fanatic. It becomes a fanatic. We are under assault. Period. We see the casualties. People dropping. I mean, we see the casualties. I think. But then, as the creators say, the people observe, but they don't really understand. They hear, but they really don't hear it. They don't understand. And it gets, and therefore you got to find people who are on the same page. That's what you got to do. And it's no compromising here. So, page 23 on the internet copy, and section 30 on part 2 on the Phil Gasper's edition. It reads, from the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized. That is, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital. From that moment, you say individuality vanishes. What he's saying is that the capitalists, because we're jumping in the middle, this is the twisting of words he's saying about the capitalists. So when the communists are talking about abolishing property and private property, or this was the archaic, this is how individual was used archaically. Individual archaically means to be separate or distinct. Oh, okay, in existence. All right, being indivisible. All right. So or not divided. And this is what he's saying about the capitalist private property. It's a social aspect because it takes many people to produce it, but yet the capitalist turns it in, or they tell us it is individual property or private property. And so we're learning what this private property is. It's capital. It's rent. Okay? It is property that can be used as a social power to, what did he say? Transform or turn people into exploited individuals. This is what he's arguing. And that's what he was explaining in the previous paragraphs. We want to do away with the property that is used to exploit others. And that's what he's explaining here. But from the moment you talk about doing away with this individuality or this private property, the bourgeoisie confuse it. That's why the bourgeoisie say, well, the communists want to do away with private property. So that's why people think the communists want to do away with their coats and their houses and their individual hard-earned property. And this is what Karl Marx is bringing to the table again, when they're talking about breaking individualism, or the capitalists try to make it seem like this individualism that the communists are talking about is each person's individual property, your own house, your clothes on your back, your food. That's not what he's making reference to. And this individual, and the reason why he's explaining this, as far as from the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital. See, when he's saying the moment when labor can be no longer, he's talking about men, labor, power. When men will no longer work to produce capital or money or rent into a property that can be monopolized. Okay? In other words, as he said, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property. So he's making clear distinction on what he means by individual property and bourgeois property. One reason being is because if you go up higher on the page 23, I don't know the number in the Phil Gasper's edition, but he argues up higher when he says to be a capitalist, it is not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. And what he's arguing is that it takes united action of many members. Nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. And since it takes all these people, or the collective effort of people to produce capital, he's arguing capital or bourgeois private property or bourgeois individualism or property, all one and the same. It cannot be private or separate or distinct or indivisible. This Can you hear me now? I don't know how that happened. Excuse me.
Yeah, hey.
All right. If you could mute your mics again. I don't know how that happened. But what I was explaining, that private property can't be indivisible. That private property, or as Marx is arguing, this individual capital, he's using it individual in front. He's using the archaic definition, meaning it's indivisible, it's not divided. Okay, it's not divided among the people. And so he's saying the capitalists use a trickery. When the communist says that they want to abolish the individual property or abolish private property, the capitalists make it seem like they're talking about the person's home, their own clothes, their hard-earned individual property. But in fact, Karl Marx is arguing this individual property they're talking about doing away with is this private property or individual property that can be monopolized for the bourgeoisie and not divided among the people. All right, this is what we're saying. Property that will not be divided. He's saying is individual or private. And Karl Marx is saying this is what the communists want to do away with. This individual character of capital. This individual character of capital is just simply saying, again, I'm sorry you all got cut off with that, where you didn't hear me. This individual character of capital is just simply capital or wealth that is independent, meaning it is separate or distinct in existence, or it is indivisible. It is not divided among the people. This is what he's arguing. Now we go to the next page. Starting in paragraph, it should be section 31 maybe. You must therefore confess that by individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeoisie or the bourgeois. He's clarifying it because he's trying to bring clarity to rumors that spread about the communists. Okay, in that we all heard about that about communism. They don't want you to have your own private property. Your individualism is taken. This is what he's just explaining how it's just bogus. The capitalists are playing on words. All right. So the individual that they're talking about is the bourgeois and their property. So he said, you must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than bourgeois, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. It got to get, they got to be removed. Removed. Now, I want you to turn to Psalm 72 again. Because sometimes these passages, we got to go back and look at the character of these, or should I say the content of these passages and think about what we're reading. In Psalm 72, once we can acknowledge how government works, the government and the head of government have administrators. That's number one. But there's something distinctly different about the government of God, which we're going to look into as we close in part 2 of the Communist Manifesto, is that the government of God, according to the Apostle Paul, it is made up of men and women. They all become joint heirs of the government of God. And the communists argue the same thing. They're saying the state or the government, which is none other than the collective proletariat. They become the state. So when we start to read, whether we get to this part tonight, when Marx and them arguing that all property should be given over to the state, if you don't know the context of what he means by the state, you would think of bourgeois governments. But he's not talking about bourgeois governments in how we see state today. When he's saying all property must be given to the state is the masses of the proletarians. They become the state. All right. Now, Psalm 72. Psalm 72. And in Psalms 72, if you notice, it says, give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness unto the king's son. He shall judge thy people with righteousness, and thy poor with judgment. The mountain shall bring peace to the people, and the little hills by righteousness, or by justice. That's what righteousness means. He shall judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the needy, and shall break in pieces the oppressor, or he shall break in pieces the bourgeoisie. See, the communists are arguing that this person, this bourgeoisie, they must be swept out of the way. All right. So what happens when something is broken in pieces? You sweep it out of the way. Now, we see the king, give the king thy judgments. Now, go to Romans chapter 8. So we could put this king in context. What it means. It's very important, just like it is important to understand what the communists mean by private property, what the communists mean by capital as an individual. And like he said, well, you know, the proletariat or the labor, he has no individuality. That's right. Why not? Because he is subject to work with a whole pool of people to produce capital. And the labor is dependent upon capital, but capital, the capitalists argue, isn't dependent upon anything. That's what they would teach us. And that's what we believe. But capital is dependent upon men labor. Okay? It's the total opposite. Everything been turned upside down. Now go to Romans. And if you have any questions on this, write it down. But I want you to follow what Karl Marx is arguing. He's just using the wordplay of the capitalists. And I just want to make that clear. He's using how the capitalists play around with the words. But he said they must be removed out of the way. Now we see in Psalms 72 verses 1 through 4, that passage describes the oppressor being broken in pieces. And it says, give thy judgment unto the king's son. Now we come to this conclusion that the king's son that's primarily being referenced in that passage is the historical Jesus of Nazareth. Now, with that being said, if we go to Romans chapter 8, this Christ or Messiah, whom we call the historical Jesus of Nazareth, I want to establish that he isn't doing this alone. Now, in Romans chapter 8, verse 14 argues, as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. In other words, if you're led by the teachings of the Almighty, if you're led by when he's saying the Spirit, meaning that consciousness, that higher consciousness, that conscience or pure conscience, if you're led by that conscience of justice and equity and peace and righteousness, then you are the sons of Elohim. And remember, righteousness is also justice. Now, if you are the sons, notice what the Apostle Paul argues. Many of us just thought that Yeshua HaMashiach of the historical Christ was the only son. No, there's others. And notice the reward of these others. Now, if we're sons, then we're children. Now, notice verse 17. It says, if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. So you know that king's son that we read about in Psalm 72? We will be joint heirs because we're looking at the kingdom of God is not like the empires of man. In fact, the kingdom of God, one of the reasons why we're doing this class is to show you that the communist describes the kingdom of God, but they use different words. We're saying joint heirs with the Messiah, but Karl Marx is saying the same thing with the rule of the proletariat. We've been establishing through previous classes that the heirs with the Christ are the proletarians. If so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. Why did he suffer? Because he went on a campaign for revolution. And the ruling class collided, or should I say the Messiah collided with the ruling class, and all of his disciples will collide with the ruling class. His true disciples. Now we're joint heirs. Joint heirs in doing what? Remember, removing this person or this persons or the bourgeoisie. Now, let's go back to the manifesto because we're going to look at a couple of the passages shortly. In fact, before you go back there, let's follow this up because Romans, I just want to show you why even the Apostle Paul will even argue this. Let's go now, again, we read this one before, but let's go to Psalms 2. Psalms, the second chapter. Let's establish this because when we're talking about the removal of the capitalists or the ruling class who have all of this property, which they have monopolized and turned into individual property or private property. And its primary use is to demand or exploit the labor of the masses. We must realize that they must be removed, and the Bible is saying it. Because some people, you can't say nothing like that. If you don't understand this practically and scientifically, I have heard, mute your mics, please. I don't know who just joined in the class. Mute your mics. But, I have heard people say to me that I'm out of order talking about this stuff because God gave them their property. God makes rich and God makes poor. Now, I'm not going to get into the context of that today, even the idea of rich and poor in the context of the scriptures. In the context of the scriptures, to be rich was that you may have 3 sheep and another man may have 1 sheep. You are richer than he is. It didn't carry the context of riches today. That's number one. And number two, the person who is rich, they are, according to the scriptures, stewards to distribute the wealth to those who need it. The Bible do not support riches and wealth in the context of individualism. Okay? But if we don't get this clear, that's the kind of nonsense that's being brought to the table. Get to see how the brother sent me a thing, CEO, he's going to pay all of his workers, or the rich man going to pay all of his workers $70,000, a year. People say, oh, wow, that's something. Oh, it sounds good, don't it? If he going to pay them $70,000, he took a pay cut, but they never said how much he made. See, he even said himself that he in times past, he made $1 million a year in times past. So he probably making more now. They were sure not to say how much he making today. He gonna pay his workers $70,000. That sounds noble, don't it? How about paying the workers every bit that they earned? It probably will exceed $70,000. Just like it sounds good for a ball player to make $30 million. That sounds good. But when you look at how much the ball player making the owner, like I said before, then you realize, that ball player is still being cheated. But anyhow, we got to understand this stuff. For people, they're not gonna understand. If you don't understand it, and if you're not motivated, then you will not move. You will not participate. You won't do anything. You will just wait for Jesus to come. If we go into Psalms 2, if you notice carefully what's being said, Psalms 2:1. Carefully pay attention. Why do the heathen rage? Now, heathen means the nations. Why are they upset? And the people imagine a vain thing. Why is it that the nations are imagining vanity? Notice this, why they're arguing. See, their rage, the reason why they're enraged is because they are imagining vain things. See, they imagine that they should keep their wealth. They imagine that the exploitation of labor and the oppression and suppression of people is legitimate. Just like today, the people in the nations imagine a vain thing. They believe capitalism is the best thing going. They believe capitalism can be reformed or tweaked to work. So whatever they're imagining is they're upset. Now, if you notice the passage, the heathen are in a rage because they're thinking about one thing on how society should roll, but they're enraged because a different ideology have confronted them. Brothers, you say, Brother Judah, what you talking about? Notice the next verse as we read into this. Verse 2, the kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together. See, they got to come up with a plan because they have run into a collision. That's what's making them upset. Now, the kings of the earth have set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord. Now, tell me, you think that they fighting a man in the sky? Notice the language. They have taken counsel together against Yahweh, the Lord. You think they seen him and they're about to go fight with him with swords? Or how did they fight against Yahweh or the Lord? Notice, and against his anointed. Wait a minute. How did they fight against Yahweh? Through his instruments. What were his instruments? His people, whom he called the anointed. Now, the anointed of God have made a collision course with the nations, and it have made the nations mad. See, but the nations believe that their society is going to run one way, which is vain, but the anointed of God is saying that the society got to run another way. And so whatever way that the nations believe that the society should be run is vain, the scripture is saying. And the kings are now, and the nations of the world are taking counsel together against the Lord. But they don't see the Lord. Who do they see? They only see his anointed. Now notice what's happening here in verse 3. Let us break their bands asunder. Let us break their shackles and cast away their cords from us. Whose cords? The people. That's why as I read the scripture, I'm being convinced more and more the duties of the people are primary, because that's how Yahweh is realized. You see what you're reading here? They taking counsel against the Lord, but they don't see the Lord. They only see the people and the rules in which the people set. You know what this teaching us, this passage teaching us? That whatever the anointed of the Lord is doing, they're on a direct collision course with the nations of the world. And whatever, and this collision course that made the nations upset. Whatever the anointed of the Lord is bringing to the table, the ruling class is calling it what? Shackles. They're claiming that the anointed of the Lord, that's why he said, let us break their cords. Don't you see this is the same thing in Communist Manifesto is saying? That the doing away with the bourgeois property is to do away with individualism or their freedom. That's what he argued last week. And that Karl Marx said the freedom for the bourgeoisie is the market and commerce. Remember that? What did they mean by freedom? Page 24 with the same thing. He said, no, I'm sorry, I went too far. What did he mean by freedom? He meant the freedom by freedom. This is page 23. By freedom is meant under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling, and buying. So if the communists are saying we're going to do away with free trade like the bourgeois or the ruling class want, the bourgeois say they're going to lose their freedom. Well, what happens when a man loses their freedom? It's signified by being shackled, right? Cords. are being put upon them. They're angry because of the way that the society is run is being interrupted. And the anointed of the Almighty, they have put bounds and cords on the ruling class. Now notice Psalms 2 and 4. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. In other words, the power or the intelligence of the universe shall be on the anointed side. But you got to keep in mind, none of the nations see God. Literally. They only see God as he's realized through his anointed. And who are the anointed called today? The saints. How is it that the saints are on a collision course with the nations of the world? How? That's politics, isn't it? When we talk about the kings of the earth, we're talking politics. When we talk about the kings of the earth coming together to take counsel, we're talking about them deliberating and organizing legislations or coming up with policies or even declaring war. We're talking politics. They're going to come together in Washington. They're going to come together in the White House. They're going to come together on Parliament, right? To take counsel together. What did the Creator say? Here we go again in verse 6. That king, remember? Verse 6, yet have I set my king upon my holy hill Zion. Remember, we done read about that king in Psalm 72. Remember, the king is to break in pieces the oppressor. But we read Romans 8 as well. And that passage said that it isn't just the Christ as king, but those who follow him are joint heirs. Those who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. Here in the Psalms is calling them the anointed. They're joint heirs. That's why they have power to bound the ruling class. Verse 7, I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Remember, we all become the sons of God. Ask of me. Notice what's being said. The heathen or the nations are angry, but the power or the intelligence of the universe, the psalmist is given a description how the universe will yield to us. Brother, what are you talking about? Because the power or the intelligence of the universe declared this. Ask of me, verse 8, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, the nations, and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. You see, the people will possess the planet. What shall you do to the ruling elite? What shall you do to the nations or the heathen that was in a rage? Verse 9, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt what? Dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. What do you do when you dash something in pieces? You sweep it out of the way. So when we read in the Communist Manifesto that these ruling class who want to possess the earth and its resources, which is the property that Karl Marx and the capitalists and the communists, are arguing about, that they got to really relinquish. He said they must be removed out of the way, swept out of the way. This is what the Bible says. But when you read in the Psalms, you see who in the world are the nations coming against? Other people. It's people involved. It's people who have took a stand and bound and brought forth cords to put upon the nations. What do you mean cords to put upon a nation? Boundaries, laws. Just like Karl Marx argued, the proletariat must take over the state. When the proletariat take over the state, we're going to read it before we get out of here. A lot of these scriptures we're going to go back over. I just want to give you a briefing and put it in your notes so you can be aware of it. We see that they shall inherit the earth. They shall inherit the earth. Now I want to look at, let's go back now. We read the same thing in Daniel chapter 7. the kingdom and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the saints, or the anointed, or the sons of God. They all one and the same. If you just meditate on those passages, you will realize that the kingdom or the government is given to the people, not a small group. It's given over to the people. Now, if we go back to the Communist Manifesto, we could probably get to that. Page 24. This person, as we read, this person indeed should be swept out of the way and made impossible. In other words, the society must be organized in such a way that it's impossible for any one person to accumulate property and capital off of the masses of the people, or the collective effort of the people, and turn it into their own private individual property. That manner of person must be removed. He continues, communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. So now he's showing you, we're not talking about people weren't earning and appropriating products of society, houses, food, clothing, to live decently and enjoying your life. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by the means of such appropriations. Communism do not allow, just like he said, this individual must be removed out of the way. What individual? The individual that accumulates property and subjugate others to labor for him to achieve this property, or to accumulate or appropriate this property. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. Now he's arguing again the argument of the capitalist. If we abolish private property, meaning we understand what he means now by private property or capital as an individual. We're understanding he's talking about capital or private property that is in the hands, exclusively in the hands of the capitalist. And the capitalist teaches that if you abolish this private property, nobody will work and everybody be thrust into universal laziness. He says, according to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs. Through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. In other words, if that's the case, then all of these rich folks who isn't working, their society should have gone to the dogs. All right, that's what he's arguing. You know, he's showing the contradiction and the hypocrisy in their arguments. He says the whole of this objection is but another expression of tautology, that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. In other words, he's just repeating the same thing, just using different words. All right, tautology. But notice, communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. It just deprives individuals to subjugate others by means of such appropriations. It just stops another man from accumulating property to subjugate and exploit others. Now, if you go to Micah, the 4th chapter, this is reminiscent of a passage in the book of Micah. Communism does not deprive man of the products of society. So even though we're talking about the Bible dealing with the division of property, as we have looked at in previous classes, let's meditate upon another passage in the book of Micah. And Micah chapter 4. Micah chapter 4. And again, these are very interesting passages when we understand the scriptures on a political scale. Sometimes you got to look and see what's behind the scenes to bring to the table what's being written. So Micah chapter 4, now notice this, verse 1. It reads, "But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the Lord's house, or the mountain of the house of the Lord, shall be established in the top of the mountains. And it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it." People shall flow unto it. Bear with me a second. What's this here? All right. Okay. All right. I see you posted it. Okay. "And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob." Now, this let us know the nations were enraged, but not all of them. Some of the nations will conform. And some going to say, let us go up to the government of God. That's what mountains signify. "And to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will do what? Teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of Jehovah, or the Lord, from Jerusalem. He shall judge among many people, and rebuke strong nations afar off." Those are the nations that were enraged. He shall rebuke them. He shall destroy them. Who? It will be manifested by nature. Okay? That's what I'm learning as well. He had these instruments and tools for his use. "He shall rebuke the strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares." This is important. We're going to look at this passage again as we go through the manifesto. "He shall beat their sword. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." So we're looking at the abolition of war. Now, that's not our focus at this moment in time. I want to look at this next one. "But they shall sit," how many men? "A few men under his vine." What does it say? "But they shall sit, every man under his vine." You see how it's showing ownership of every man. Every man shall have a piece. So we're not talking about the doing away with individual property. We're not talking about doing away with, as Karl Marx argued, the products of society. We see here in the scriptures that once the oppressor is broken, then it will present an opportunity for every man to have a vine, for every man to have a fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. "For the mouth of Jehovah of hosts," when you see that, we talking about how he does war. The Jehovah, or God of war, the God of hosts, have spoken it. What do you mean none shall make them afraid? They won't be afraid of anyone taking their portion. So when we read this, it's important to look and realize what kind of society are they planning. First, they're saying it was preceded by, they shall do what with their weapons of war? Turn them into pruning hooks and plowshares. Well, the byproduct of pruning hooks and plowshares, isn't it fig trees and vines? Isn't that what you get after you finish plowing? You plow the land to get produce. So they're using fig trees and vines to show every man shall have a part of the food. No man will be hungry. No man will be left out. They will all get a portion of what is being produced in society, because this is what's going on nationwide, the production of produce and food. No man shall be left out. What has happened, though? The social character of the land, meaning that is no longer owned by the oppressor. It is now available to every man to eat. Every man. This is how I argue the Bible is meant to be understood. Not this stuff that the people bring in today, because you won't do anything. Some people don't even realize where heaven will be. I ask me, where heaven gonna be at? Well, nobody knows. I know y'all heard me say this before, but they say nobody knows. No, people do know. You don't know, and you don't care to know, because heaven been taught to you to be some fictitious place above the clouds on the other end of the rainbow some damn way. When the Bible keeps teaching heaven will be realized in the earth once the social character of property is changed and the conduct of the human being is altered to a course of justice. That's when heaven will be brought here. But that won't happen until what? Did you read where it says, come, let us learn the ways, and the God of Jacob shall teach us of his ways? You see how it always preceded by education? If you don't understand what's going on, how in the heck would you fight for anything? And I've come to the conclusion so far, I don't know what tomorrow holds, but the way that religion or the Bible has been presented to us, it's been presented in a way in which the people do not get the meat and the food of what's in this thing, what's in these scriptures. And that's the only way they can do it, because the scriptures, like I was telling people the other day, you don't have to worry about the Bible being tampered with. That was never an issue. Man don't have that much power. But what man can do is cause you not to read it. And then what else? And if they cause you not to read it, what can man do? They can tell you what it say. People sit up here and talk about what the Bible is, Bible that, and half of the thing, 90% of the stuff they saying is not even in the Bible. It's not even in there. It's what they done heard some preacher says, or when I heard somebody else say. It's not in there. So that's why we got to get educated. And I'm using a secular document to show you real time how the Bible is painting a picture for us. So, if you will, every man will get a portion of the products of society. You see that? Because the society products, the land and the resources will be converted to the people. Who are the people? They're the rulers. And now we see that they shall seize possession of the earth. And that's why the heathen will be, the nations who he's going to rebuke, going to be upset. Just like the bourgeoisie arguing Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie going to feel, they're going to say our freedom has been taken away. Back in the Communist Manifesto. All objections, this should be the third paragraph on page 24. Well, let me see, 1, 2, 3, yeah, fourth paragraph maybe. All objections urged against the communist mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. And appropriate, we're going to find out what he means. We're going to get more into this. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself. Remember, using another word. What is class property? Class property is the bourgeois property. Well, what is the bourgeois property? It is capital as an individual. It is capital as private property. So this is what he's saying, the bourgeois property again, and he's explaining. Just as the bourgeois or the capitalist class argues the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. In other words, there's nothing else left. If you do away with the capitalist property, then they argue, then no man, you're doing away with all men property. No man to have anything. He's just talking about the exaggerations of the capitalists. It's the same thing with the culture. If you they argue there is no other culture or ideology outside of capitalist ideology that's worth anything, that's even worth knowing. So if you do away with capitalism, you know, they equate this or translate this into chaos. There's nothing. You have nothing else if you get rid of capitalism. You have no more culture. It's chaos. They call you barbarians, right? All societies that wasn't capitalist or feudal in this development, what did the capitalists call the Native Americans and the indigenous people who dwelt in the land of America when they got here? Uncivilized barbarians. They didn't even regard their cultures. But they had an advanced culture, it was more advanced than the capitalist culture. So this is what he's arguing. The culture or this intellectual, because culture is a part of intellectual production. Culture and arts and sciences. You do away with it, they say there's nothing else left. That culture, the loss of which he laments, meaning the capitalist, the culture that the capitalist laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. Got to mute your mic, bro, and your camera's on, so they can see you. If you don't know, Marquess Burton, your camera's on.
Oh, sorry.
You got to mute your mic, and you might want to turn off your camera.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on.
All right. Okay. All right, there you go.
Okay.
Now,
work.
For the enormous majority, a mere training, this culture, he's saying that the capitalists don't want to lose. This culture for the majority of the people, the culture we live in, is none other than a mere training to act as a machine. The culture in which the capitalists don't want to lose is this same culture that subjugates us to labor, that turns us into commodities and products. It turns us into just mere products of, or commodities, or mere instruments of production, like a machine. This is what this culture produces, and this is what this culture or the capitalists do not want to do away with. This is what he's arguing. Now you understand in Psalms 2 why the nations were angry? When you are coming with a counterculture to seize possession of the capitalist class and to take its capital or individual property and turn it over for every man can have a part with his own vine tree, his own fig tree, then you can understand why the nation was upset. They wanted to keep their culture, and they counseled together to keep their culture. But what did the power in heaven say? He's going to laugh at it. In other words, it's saying not that God is really up there in heaven laughing. He just simply conveying to the human being how he's looking at their efforts. It's futile. It's nothing. It shall be crushed. All right? No threat to him at all. The power of heaven is going to work against them. Now notice, but don't wrangle with us. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property. And he's reiterating, so people who's reading this document will know the truth of what the communists stand for. Doing away with bourgeois property, while he's exposing how the bourgeois is playing on words and distorting the truth of what the communists want to do. So he said, don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property. The standard of your bourgeois notion of freedom, right? This is what he's saying. Whatever the bourgeois is calling freedom, the standard of bourgeois freedom, the standard of bourgeois culture and law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. Look, Your very ideas are but the outgrowth. Your ideas come from the condition in which you have set. That's why I'm arguing it is a war of ideas. Most of our ideas are sprung or they have been brought forth from this culture. Therefore, our ideas are misplaced. We have to formulate ideas outside of this culture. I'll show you what I mean. I was talking to a couple of young men today. I'm gonna tell you what I mean by that. Now, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and the bourgeois property. Just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all. In other words, your law is just simply the will of the ruling class. That's it. And will choose essential character whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. In other words, the ideas and the culture and the law, everything we see today, they're all rooted they're the bourgeoisie ideas. Now, I was talking to a couple of young men today, and I just had to ask them, what is the future? What do y'all think? They were in their 30s. And, they said some say, I don't know. I just simply don't know. He said, I need to be thinking about stuff like this. I just live day to day. I just don't know. But one of them, they began to talk about, how things are messed up. And they began to talk about if just rich people, he said, if 10 rich people would invest $1 million a year to rebuild the neighborhood, to rebuild homes, then, everything could be all right. See, that's a bourgeois idea, because building homes and rebuilding neighborhoods will never abolish the bourgeois class, will it? Two, what I tried to express to them today is that, look, that glass, timber, bricks, drywall, copper, iron, you need that iron to run your gas line, you need that copper to run your water lines, you need copper for your electricity, you need sand mines and blast furnaces to make glass, all of these resources. You need to revamp living conditions. Who owns it? Who owns the mines of the iron ore? Who owns the mines to dig brass? Who owns that? And then who owns the equipment to turn that brass, smelt it down, and turn that brass to copper piping or copper tubing or copper wiring for electricity and water? Who owns that? As long as the people don't own it, then the prices will always be dictated and the people will always be enslaved. Always. Because they're always adjusting prices, don't they? All they got to do is raise the price, right? Unless they're removed, then you will not find any liberation. But that whole idea of people just invest, it's like go green energy. People look at me, man, I understand how people feel about me, but you don't never have any good news. I do, you don't really want to hear it, but you got to hear the bad news first. So I remember sitting in meetings about green energy. In fact, we had some of the meetings at Askers, and how, people got to get up on the green energy. My question is, well, if you're talking about green energy and you're talking about part of the green energy craze was windmills and solar paneling. You know what I needed to know, though? Who owns the materials to produce that solar panel? Who have the copper and the resources to make the battery cells? Who's making it? I don't give a doggone about no green energy as long as the capitalists continue to hold the resources. Then they will always determine the prices, and they always play hangman with us. Who owns the resources? It never come into question because it's just simply bourgeois ideas. That's it. You can tell a bourgeois idea because it's always got to do with some kind of reform or some kind of tweaking of capital, but it's never the removal of the means of production and the capitalist property. Never come into question. Yeah, just give us more pay, give us more jobs, get rid of the debt, give us free tuition. Free tuition to go to school, to go to the universities. And once you go to the university, what you're going to do? You're going to be employed by the capitalists, and the capitalists will still maintain their property, and the capitalist property never come into question. You can tell bourgeois ideas. Why? Because that's just their culture. So now we got to start to think outside of their culture. And when we think outside their culture, what the Bible say? The nation's going to be upset. They're going to be enraged. Enraged. At who, though? God. But you think you're going to see somebody up in the sky shaking a fist? Or will they be enraged by the collective effort of people who've been convinced they have a new idea on how the earth should be run? When they present this new idea on how the earth should be run, and they're communicating with other human beings to join ranks on how this earth should be run, then we will find the nations fighting against God and his anointed. Let's go back into the manifesto. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, the social form springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. In other words, this is what the communists or the capitalists share with all other oppressive societies. And what is that? They reason within themselves. They have this misconception that their culture are actually part of eternal laws of nature and of reason. That's what they teach us. That this is the way it is. Man is made to compete against man because it's in his nature. It's natural for man to conduct himself this way. It's natural for man to go to war and kill one another over resources. That's natural. And this is what all preceding bourgeois societies, they turn their culture into, he said, this selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, the social form springing from your present mode of production. These social forms that come from your production and from your ownership of property. You have turned this into natural law. And you have this in common with all that preceded you. He's going to explain, he's going to talk about some of them. What you see clearly in the case of the ancient property, you could say under the Roman Empire. What you admit in the case of feudal property, so from ancient Rome to papal Rome, from ancient Roman property to the feudal form of property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. In other words, the rich would talk about how bad feudalism was. Because at that time, they couldn't get rich. It was just the popes. And then they would talk about how bad the Roman elite was. But they never talk about how bad their present system is. That's what the communists, that's what Marxists are. When it comes down to looking at themselves in the mirror, their society is legitimate. In fact, it's nothing else besides it that's worthwhile. And people ask, well, you don't want capitalism. Well, what do you want? Socialism. Communism, I want in essence. That is the goal. People say, well, all these communist countries. And soon people say that, I know they don't know what the HELL they talking about. Because there haven't been any communist countries. You know that? People say, well, China communist, man, look. China is as much as a communist country